On the afternoon of January 20th, 1996, three teenage girls in a small Brazilian city were walking home from work. It was an ordinary Saturday, the kind of afternoon nobody remembers until they do. Near a vacant lot, behind a low concrete wall, something was crouched in the weeds. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a person. The girls would later struggle to describe it at all, except to say that its eyes were red, its skin looked wet, and it did not move like anything they had ever seen alive. Within 72 hours, military vehicles were reportedly moving through the streets of their city. Within a month, a soldier allegedly connected to the case was dead. Within a year, a formal military inquiry had been opened, and just as quietly, closed. This is the file on Varginha. Some call it Brazil's Roswell. Nearly 30 years later, nobody, not the witnesses, not the ufologists, not the Brazilian military itself, agrees on what actually happened. We're not going to tell you what to believe. We're going to walk you through exactly what was reported, in the order it was reported, and let you decide where the story stops making sense. Before there was a creature, there was a crash. 7 days before the girls saw anything, on January 13th, 1996, a college professor and ultralight aircraft pilot named Carlos de Souza was flying near a stretch of rural farmland outside Varginha, a mid-sized city in the state of Minas Gerais, southeastern Brazil. Varginha itself is not remarkable. It's a coffee and dairy town, a few hours from São Paulo, the kind of place that makes headlines for agriculture, not extraterrestrials. According to de Souza's own account, given in later interviews, what he saw that afternoon was a cigar-shaped object crossing the sky, but not flying normally. It was trailing a strange vapor, not the kind of smoke you'd expect from a mechanical fire, but something closer to a mist, clinging to the object rather than dispersing behind it. To de Souza, a trained pilot, it looked like something in trouble, something losing control. He says he followed it, watching it descend toward a rural property near a farm known locally as the Mayalini farm, on the outskirts of the city. And then it was gone. Not exploded, not visibly crashed in the way a plane crash looks. Just gone, beyond a tree line, beyond his sight line. De Souza reported what he'd seen, and here is where the case begins to take its shape. Not with an answer, but with a gap. Attempts over the following decades to obtain flight radar data, air traffic logs, or any official confirmation of an unidentified object over that airspace on January 13th have gone nowhere. Not confirmed, not denied. Simply unavailable or never released. If you're building a skeptical case, this is where you'd stop and shrug. An ultralight pilot, flying alone, sees something ambiguous in hazy sky conditions, and in hindsight, knowing what would happen a week later, reframes it as connected. Memory does that, especially when a story like Varginha is going to dominate the following months. But if you're building the other case, the case that something did come down that week, this is the origin point. A trained aviator, in the air, watching an object descend under what looked like distress, in the exact area where, 7 days later, panic would break out over something crouched in the grass. We don't know which case is correct. What we do know is that de Souza's account predates the girls' encounter, predates the media circus, predates the military rumors. Which means if it's fabricated, it was fabricated early, and consistently, for almost 30 years. Pause beat. Let this sit before moving to Act 2. What we can say for certain is this. Something shifted in Varginha that week. Not visibly, not publicly, but administratively. Local emergency responders would later be tied, however loosely, to reports of unusual activity near the Mayalini farm in the days that followed. Nothing official, nothing on the record. Just the kind of quiet local murmur that, in a town this size, moves faster than any news broadcast. And then, on the 20th, the story stopped being about the sky. Lilian Silva was 16. Her sister Valkyria was 14. Their friend, Katia Xavier, was also a teenager. On the afternoon of January 20th, 1996, the three of them were walking home from a job. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested their day was about to become the most scrutinized 90 seconds in Brazilian UFO history. They were walking near a vacant, overgrown lot in a residential part of Varginha, when Lillian says she saw something near a low wall, crouched, still. At first, in the confusion of the moment, one of them reportedly thought it might be some kind of large dog, malformed or injured. But as they got closer, and by every account they did get closer, close enough that the details matter, the shape resolved into something none of them could categorize. The being they described was small. Some accounts place it at under 1.5 meters tall, shorter than an average teenager, crouched low, almost folded in on itself. Its skin was described as oily, brownish, wet-looking, more like the surface of an amphibian than anything mammalian. Its head was disproportionate, large in relation to its body, with 3 raised protrusions along the top that none of the girls could explain. Not horns exactly, not anything they had a word for. And the eyes. Every account, then and now, keeps returning to the eyes. Large. Red. Some witnesses would later describe them as almost glowing, though whether that's an accurate description of bioluminescence or simply how a frightened 16-year-old's brain processes an impossible sight in fading afternoon light is, of course, impossible to verify 30 years later. The girls didn't investigate. They didn't take a photo. This was 1996, before phones had cameras, before pics or it didn't happen was a cultural reflex. They ran, and when they got home, they didn't tell people they'd seen a UFO occupant. They told their families they'd seen something demonic. That detail matters, and it's worth sitting with. These weren't ufologists. They weren't primed to interpret an ambiguous shape as alien. Their first instinct, their gut framing, was religious horror, which is either evidence that they encountered something genuinely outside normal experience, or evidence of exactly how a rural Catholic upbringing processes an unexplained fright. Both readings are available to you. Neither one is obviously wrong. Word moved through Varginha the way it moves through any small city, fast and distorted a little more with every retelling. By the next day, other residents were reportedly describing similar sightings in nearby areas. A strange figure near a different part of town, glimpsed by different people, in accounts that were never as thoroughly documented as the girl's story, but which fed the growing sense that something had happened, and that it wasn't contained to one vacant lot. By January 21st, according to multiple later accounts, residents began noticing military and emergency vehicles moving through parts of the city. Not a visible cordon, not an announced operation, just the kind of low-key, unexplained mobilization that, in a town that size, everybody notices and nobody officially comments on. Local television affiliates and eventually Brazil's national network, Globo, picked up the story. Within weeks, it wasn't just a Varginha rumor, it was a national one. This is where the Varginha case splits into 2 timelines that run in parallel for the next 30 years. The story that was reported at the time, and the story that has been added to it since, sometimes decades later, by new witnesses coming forward. At the time, in early 1996, the story was mostly what you've just heard. Sighting, panic, a vague sense of military presence. What came later, much later, in some cases not until 2025, is a second layer: hospital testimony. The claim, repeated across multiple later interviews with local residents and, in recent years, hospital staff, is that a creature, described in terms strikingly similar to what the 3 girls reported, was brought into a regional hospital in Varginha through a service or back entrance, not through the emergency room's public intake. Some accounts describe hospital staff being kept away from a specific area.
Some describe a strong, persistent smell of ammonia in the vicinity, a detail that recurs across multiple independent witness accounts and has never been fully explained by conventional means. Most significantly, and most recently, a physician named Dr. Italo Venturelli has, in testimony given decades after the fact, described what he characterizes as direct involvement, a living, non-human patient brought in under unusual secretive circumstances,
followed by what he describes as an armed removal of the individual and threats made to hospital staff to ensure silence. We want to be precise about what this is and isn't. This is on-the-record testimony, given by a named individual, decades after the alleged event. It is not contemporaneous documentation. There is no hospital admission record that has been made public. There is no imaging, no lab report, no chain of custody paperwork. Nothing that would satisfy a courtroom, or, frankly, a rigorous journalist. What there is consistency. The ammonia smell, the back entrance intake, the armed presence. These specific details show up across multiple witnesses who, as far as public record shows, were not coordinating their stories, which either means something genuinely unusual happened in that hospital in January 1996, or it means a specific vivid local rumor calcified over decades into something that now sounds, to multiple separate people, like a shared memory. Human memory does that. Communities do that. A story told often enough, in a small enough town, stops being, "I heard this happened," and starts being, "I remember this happening," even for people who weren't there. That's not an accusation against any specific witness. It's just the reason investigators are supposed to weigh decades-old testimony differently than same-week reporting. Alongside the hospital claims came claims of military recovery. That Brazilian army personnel and local firefighters had secured the vacant lot and, separately, the area near the Maiolini farm, and had removed both debris and what witnesses described as more than one non-human individual. Some reportedly deceased, at least one reportedly alive. Again, no recovered material has ever been produced publicly. No debris has been independently tested and verified. What exists is testimony, growing in volume and detail over 3 decades, and an official silence that has never fully closed the door on the story, even as it has never confirmed a single element of it. Tone shift here. Slower, more somber. This section involves a real person's death and should be handled with restraint, not sensationalism. On February 15th, 1996, just under a month after the sighting near the vacant lot, a 23-year-old military police officer named Marco Eli Cerese died in a hospital in Minas Gerais. The official medical record is not ambiguous about the immediate cause. Cerese had undergone a minor procedure to drain an abscess under his arm. In the following days, he developed a severe bacterial infection that progressed to septicemia, blood poisoning, and ultimately acute respiratory failure. He died from complications of that infection. That is the documented medical explanation, and there is no official record disputing it. What ufologists have claimed in the years since is a very different narrative. That Cerese had been among the personnel involved in the alleged capture or transport of one of the beings from the Varginha site, that he had come into direct physical contact with it, and that his subsequent illness and death were connected to that contact, whether through some kind of biological agent, contamination, or something less easily categorized. There is no medical or forensic evidence connecting his death to anything other than a bacterial infection following a routine procedure. A rare but medically unremarkable, if tragic, complication that predates Varginha by centuries and has nothing inherently exotic about it. But the timing is the reason this detail refuses to disappear from the story. A young, healthy soldier, allegedly connected,
however tenuously, to the most scrutinized UFO case in Brazilian history, dies of a sudden and severe illness less than a month later. Correlation is not causation. Every statistician, every doctor, every skeptic will tell you that, correctly. But timing like that is precisely the kind of detail that keeps a case alive for 30 years, regardless of what the paperwork says. We're presenting both threads to you exactly as they exist: a documented medical cause of death, and an undocumented, unproven claim connecting that death to the events 6 days earlier. You can hold both of those facts in your head at the same time. That's what this case asks of you, again and again. In August of 1996, two Brazilian ufologists, Vittorio Paccaccini and Maxis Portis, published a book titled Incidente A.M.A. Varginha, Incident in Varginha, which did something no prior reporting had done. It named specific military personnel it claimed were directly involved in capturing and transporting one of the recovered beings. That's a serious accusation to put into print against named individuals in a country with functioning defamation law. And it triggered an actual formal response. Not silence, not a shrug, but a military police inquiry. Inquérito Policial Militar número 18, opened in 1997 by the Army Sergeant's School in Três Corações, a city near Varginha. The inquiry ran from February to June of 1997. It produced 2 physical volumes, 357 pages of investigative material, now archived in Brazil's Superior Military Court records, under the case number 18/1997. This is not an internet rumor. This is a real, physical, government-archived legal document, and its existence alone tells you that Brazilian military authorities took the accusations seriously enough to formally investigate them. Its conclusion, according to reporting from Spanish newspaper El País and others who've reviewed the record, was that the story was fictitious, that the named military personnel had not participated in any operation involving unusual cargo, and that no evidence supported the claim of a capture or transport operation. So where does that leave us? On one hand, an official investigation conducted by the very institution accused of the cover-up, concluding there was no cover-up. That's either the end of the story, or, depending on how much trust you extend to a military investigating allegations against its own personnel, exactly the kind of finding a cover-up would produce. We're not going to resolve that tension for you, because it can't honestly be resolved with the evidence available. What we can tell you is that the paper trail is real, it's archived, and it's the closest thing to an official position Brazil has ever taken on Varginha. A formal, on-the-record denial, reached through an internal process, with no independent outside verification of its methodology. If Varginha were simply a 1996 story with a 1997 official denial, this would be a shorter documentary. But almost 30 years later, the case is not closed. It's arguably more active now than it's been in decades. In recent testimony, including statements gathered by investigative filmmaker James Fox, presented publicly alongside members of the US Congress, new witnesses have come forward, some for the first time, describing elements of the case that were never part of the original 1996 reporting. Additional claims about a US cargo aircraft allegedly flying into Brazil without standard authorization in January 1996, loading what one witness described only as unusual cargo, and departing again, a claim that notably extends the story beyond a purely Brazilian military matter and into an international one. Estimates offered in that testimony suggest that as many as 30 to 40 American personnel might have knowledge of such an operation if it occurred, and the individuals presenting this material have specifically and publicly called on any of those people to come forward. The US Department of Defense, for its part, maintains its standing position. No US government program related to non-human craft or biological material, and no evidence connecting reported UAP incidents to extraterrestrial life. That denial is consistent with the position the Pentagon has taken on UAP cases generally, not specific to Varginha, which either means Varginha simply doesn't rise to whatever threshold would change that position, or means it's being denied along with everything else by default. This is, right now, an open story. Not open in the sense of being actively investigated by a government body. As far as public record shows, it isn't. But open in the sense that new named witnesses continue to come forward, decades after the fact, adding testimony that has never been independently corroborated, but has also never been formally rebutted, the way the 1997 inquiry rebutted the earlier capture claims. Here is what we can tell you with confidence. On January 20th, 1996, 3 teenage girls in Varginha, Brazil, reported seeing something they could not explain, and their fear, at the time, was genuine enough that they told their families they'd seen something demonic, not something extraterrestrial. That part of the story was never
seriously disputed, not even by skeptics. Everything after that point, the crash, the hospital, the recovery, the cover-up, the inquiry's denial, and the new testimony still emerging 3 decades later, exists in a space between documented fact and undocumented memory, getting more elaborate, not less, the further we get from the afternoon it started. Maybe that's what happens to every unexplained story, given enough time and enough retelling. Or maybe some stories get more elaborate because more people are finally willing to say what they saw. We don't know which one this is. Neither, it seems, does anyone else.